Great turnout. I'm Joel Mangers. I'm the director here. How many people have been here before? Wow, so it's like this side of the room, and people are great. Well, excellent. So if you don't know anything about us, I'm so excited that you are here. And we have the Darger collection in the back room, which is really a coup. I mean, we were really lucky. Kyoko Lerner donated it to us a few years back, and we sort of reconstructed it back there, and you can get an idea of how Henry Darger spent his hours and his days. So make sure you get back there and visit it. And tell your friends about us. Like us on Facebook. Become members. Support us. Help us in our mission, because we're really excited about what we're doing here. And we're exceptionally excited to have Michael Moon here today. He's a professor at Emory University, and he's written several books, but we're going to sort of focus on the Darger book, which we're selling in our bookstore. So without further ado, thank you.
Just to take in this audience, you all look great. I never know who I'm going to see when I go give a talk, so it's great to see you. Thanks for turning out. I have this belief. Oh, you can hear me. Is it too loud? Is it okay?
No, it's good.
It's good.
Okay, good. I really feel that, for me, the best way to understand Darger is in context. So I'm going to talk about Darger, and I'm going to talk about the weather, and I'm going to talk about Darger in a couple of contexts. There's seats over here, y'all. So, Darger and others, as well as Darger and the weather. I want to thank Joel and Jerry and Heather and your colleagues here at the Intuit Center for inviting me and for being so hospitable to me from the time I was invited and making all these arrangements. I've really appreciated it and enjoyed it. So it's really good to meet you now. What else do I want to say? When I received your invitation last summer, my book, Darger's Resources, had just come out in the spring. So I thought for a while about what I might want to say, what else I might want to say about Darger's work now that my book was finished and I had a book's worth of say about that. So I decided to talk about the weather, which is, as many of you know, a major topic and focus in Darger's work that I hadn't really addressed in the work that I had published to that point. Probably a lot of you know that he kept meticulous weather diaries day in and day out for 10 years late in his life. And also, weather takes center stage in the history of my life by Henry Darger, his autobiography, because some of you know only really the first couple hundred pages of it is autobiography. And then there are 5,000 pages about the mother of all mean Midwestern tornadoes, which Darger calls Sweetie Pie. So I chose as my topic Darger and weather, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized I might as well have announced my topic here today as Darger and war, or Darger and religion, or Darger and sex, because you how to put this, scratch the weather enough I think in looking at and thinking about Darger's work, and it just reveals a lot about the work. I'm not sure it reveals much about him personally, and I'll address that again as I go on. Now, the weather is proverbially the thing you talk about with somebody whom you don't know or whom you have nothing else to talk about. So we have all this everyday weather talk. Some weather we're having, huh? Wet enough for you? Is it hot? Like so many memories people allegedly have about Henry Darger, the fact that people who are on record, on published record, as having engaged in some kind of conversation with Henry Darger, by and large recall these kinds of routine exchanges about the weather. But I think those tell us more about the routines of socialization or not socialization in our society than they do about Henry Darger, since we make these kinds of exchanges with people all the time, many of us do. But besides its function as a default, for when you don't have anything else to say to somebody and you talk about the weather, besides its serving as a default topic of conversation, the weather and sort of being aware of what the weather is doing is actually a very meaningful activity and focus of awareness for a significant minority of people. And I think Darger must have been one of these. So my talk's in two sections, two halves. and the first half is weather and war. For me, a big clue to the way that Darger and many other people of his time may have experienced and understood the weather lies in the full title of Darger's magnum opus, The Realms of the Unreal. If we think about that. When he speaks of the great military conflict at the heart of that saga as the Glandico-Angelinian war storm. When I started studying Darger's work 10 or 12 years ago, I thought, that's such an odd phrase. That's such an odd turn of phrase. Is it a war or is it a storm? Because I thought of war as something that was political and human, and I thought of storm as something that was weather and natural, and it seemed very strange to me to have this entity that was the war storm. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that with all the buzz about global warming and all the extreme weather we've been experiencing recently, I believe it's made us increasingly aware that weather actually doesn't just happen, which is the way that I had gotten used to thinking about weather, that it was natural and that it just happened. And we've become recently much more aware, many of us have, that human behaviors really can affect weather a lot, and in fact can change the weather in a way that may be irreversible, and that's what we're wondering about and questioning now. So, and as for war, I grew up with this anti-war activist generation, or the part of it that was anti-war activist in the 1960s when I was a teenager. And so when I think about the penchant of the US government to keep getting involved in wars, I think about all these fellow US citizens we have who think that war is natural. And that's never struck me as making a lot of sense, but now that even the weather isn't as natural as it used to seem, I think we have an easy comeback to anybody who tries to tell us that war is natural. Now, the term war storm certainly occurs in work of other writers and artists before Darger. It occurs, for example, in a poem about the Civil War by fireside poet John Greenleaf Whittier. These are just some dandy tornado photos from the U.S. Weather Service, as long as we're going to talk about the weather. I grew up in north central Oklahoma, in Tornado Alley, so this was the view out our back door. So head for the cellar. Woo, that's John Greenleaf Whittier. The poem in which the phrase war storm occurs of Whittier's is entitled Our River. And it appeared in Whittier's 1864 volume called In Wartime. The poem was written in 1861, the first year of the Civil War, for a summer festival on the Merrimack River in New England. The first 6 stanzas of the poem are very deceptively leisurely, just describing the pastoral beauties of the Merrimack River. But then in the 7th stanza, the idyll is shattered and violently interrupted by the coming of war to the scene. Whittier writes, "The drums roll loud, the bugle fills the summer air with clangor. The war storm shakes the solid hills beneath its tread of anger." I can just imagine Darger reading this and coming across this stanza in a collection of Civil War poetry of the kind that he might well have picked up since he was so interested in the Civil War all his life. And I can really imagine Darger liking Whittier's image of the war storm, angrily stomping through the hills so hard and heavily as to make the hills shake. Can imagine Darger absorbing that into his memory, consciously or unconsciously. But at the same time, I don't mean to suggest that I feel any kind of confidence or certainty that the idea of war storm, or the term war storm, came out of Whittier's poem in particular. The yoking of military violence on a mass scale and severe weather and its potential violent or actual violence is commonplace enough and was well back into the 19th century. So Darger may have just come up with the phrase, or may have just certainly seemed to himself to come up with the phrase war storm under the pressure and excitement of naming his great saga, the Glandico-Angelinian war storm. First thing I did when I started studying Darger was to go to the Museum of American Folk Art in New York and start going through the 100 or so books that were left in Darger's room at the time he vacated it. Among these 100 or so books were many that I expected to find. The Wizard of Oz, of course with its own severe weather, that cyclone that blows Dorothy all the way from Kansas to Oz. But also Heidi, a couple volumes of the Bobbsey twins, stories from Dickens's novels retold for children. But there were also many titles that I hadn't previously encountered and was interested to find them among Darger's personal library. Among these, knowing of Darger's love of the weather, I was intrigued to find this little volume, this is the title page, entitled Making the Weather by Alexander Macadie, published by, as you can see, New York Macmillan, 1923. The title page of this little book informs the reader that Alexander Macadie was a professor of meteorology at Harvard and director of the Blue Hill Observatory outside Boston. Macadie had been a central participant in the establishment of the U.S. Weather Bureau, so he was definitely a weather insider. He was a fellow of the Royal Meteorological Association in the UK and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Letters in the United States. So in a way, and this is what all the small print tells you, in a way it's hard to imagine somebody more at the other end of the social and political spectrum from Darger than Alexander Macadie was. But as I've gone on to read Making the Weather, since I found it in Darger's personal library all those years ago, and reading others of Macadie's weather books, I've come to feel that Darger might well have felt a deep bond with Macadie. Because even though Macadie was occupying a different level of society, he's completely sold on the idea that the weather is the most important factor in human history. So it's a really unusual theory of history. Macadie writes in various chapters in this book and others of his, he says, so Moses and the Israelites managed to walk across the Red Sea. How did they do that? Macadie has the answer. They simply took advantage of a strong east wind, which made the water shallower than it would have been. And they just passed nimbly over, leaving the Egyptians pursuing them in their heavy horse-drawn war chariots to drown in the muddy currents that succeeded the shallow currents when the wind shifted. So, war storm is clearly not a term that would have troubled Alexander Macadie. In fact, he would have found it completely compatible. Indeed, he insists in his book that the great military commanders, the greatest military commanders, are those who have proven themselves adept not only at military strategy, but at doping out in advance the likely effects that the weather is going to have on military action. In the following essays, Macadie writes in his preface, it will be pointed out that battles and campaigns planned without regard to the prevailing weather all too frequently result in disaster. See why Darger liked this book? Mm-hmm. No commander, however great his skill, nor however large his army, can afford to neglect the weather, end quote. In another chapter, Macadie has another one of his big historical questions. What finally defeated Napoleon, he asks, and answers, an average Russian winter, which did what the massed armies of Europe had been unable to do, reducing Bonaparte and his supposedly invincible army of 450,000 soldiers to a ragged, defeated heap. In another essay in his book, Macadie goes on, quote, it is pointed out that an inaccurate forecast of wind conditions resulted in the loss of a crack cruiser and all her crew, carrying with them to the bottom of the Atlantic a soldier, Kitchener of Khartoum, who, Macadie says, was the only military commander of the age who could have stopped the Russian Revolution. There is no chapter about the Russian Revolution, but you can tell from context what Macadie thought of it. Macadie, at the time he published this, was only a few years back from being a major in the U.S. Army in World War I. And so one last chapter in the book details stories told by him by soldiers returning from the front in World War I at the end of the war. And he, according to Macadie, who really has a flair for the dramatic, again, you see the the potential resonance with Darger. He says a lot of the soldiers spoke about how the greatest and most powerful general of the war, of World War I, was General Rain. General Rain, the last 6 to 9 months of the war, simply poured all over the Western Front and ended the war in the particular way that it did. I mean, this is funny, but extremely sadly, troops of soldiers were drowning in mud and flash flooding the last months of World War I, and it did certainly have something to do with the fact that it ended then, and the victories and defeats that were handed out had a lot to do with how people were maneuvering or not being able to across acres, hundreds of acres of flooded mud. So in these pronouncements of Macadie's about the world historical super significance of the weather, I do think we hear a kind of thinking and also kind of the accents of the prose. I'm not saying that particularly that I think Macadie influenced Darger, but I think Darger probably found somebody who not only felt something of the same reverence and awe he did about the weather and its ability to shape not only natural catastrophe, but the political and military catastrophe of lost battles and lost wars. As many of you know who know Darger's work, one of the most characteristic situations to be found in his paintings is the scene of a large group of children frolicking in a panoramic landscape, from one far edge of which ominous storm clouds are just beginning to roll in. And if you can look all around the painting for a long time and maybe not notice that right-hand margin where ominous storm clouds are just beginning to roll in. In another entirely characteristic situation in some of Darger's paintings, some kind of terrible mayhem is being carried out on a group of girl combatants by those evil Glandolinian soldiers. There are a number of paintings in which the 7 Vivian girls themselves are captured and threatened with torture and execution, but as many of you know, they always escape. And interestingly, in a couple of Darger's paintings, there's a storm, a cyclone, a tornado arriving, and it actually rescues the Vivian girls from the evil Glandolinian soldiers. So I don't know many other narratives in which, I mean, I know about the cavalry arriving at the last minute, but the tornado zooming in and like blowing away the villains and saving the Vivian girls, the idea of a tornado as rescuer or deliverer is, I think, almost unique to Darger. And in that respect, he outdoes Macadie in his sense of almost a substitution of weather for some more older, more conventional idea like divine providence and so on. I mean, it's pretty conspicuous that Macadie and perhaps Darger too are perfectly willing to substitute some well-founded weather lore about the effect of winds on the Red Sea for the way the story is told in the Bible, which is a story about divine providence and God interfering and performing miracles to deliver the Israelites and punish the Egyptians. So I want to look with you at one of these paintings where the Vivian girls are being captured. In this image, in the sky above them, we see floating among banks of clouds the pigtailed head there in the upper right-hand corner, the pigtailed head of a little girl who's being strangled by a pair of puffy, gloved white hands, which themselves look as though they may be related to the clouds that surround them. It's weird that the clouds in the sky, which we see in many other of Darger's scenes, metamorphosing into deadly winds, blowing to pieces everything in their path, here seem to be associated with the act of strangulation. So you have a super powerful wind depriving somebody of their wind, or in the act of depriving somebody of their wind. It's paradoxical, and it's a paradox that needs to be articulated in language if it's to be registered, I think, because if you don't think about the terms, you don't think about the very odd paradoxical relation between the strangling of somebody's wind and the super wind of the superstorm. John McGregor, in a discussion of Darger's writing about that super tornado Sweetie Pie that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk in Darger's History of My Life, discusses a super interesting passage from in History of My Life, describing a similar scene where a little girl, or at least the head or upper body, is depicted as being strangled by a pair of, again, kind of disembodied hands up in the sky. But in that description, of Sweetie Pie, the tornado, super tornado, the hands are said to squeeze tighter and tighter, and the tongue is forced farther and farther out of the little girl's, this giant little girl's head in the sky. The tongue is forced farther and farther out of her mouth until it touches the earth, at which point it turns into a powerful twister. And then everything sort of gets blown away and dispelled. So there's another kind of odd narrative where a situation of strangulation and deprival of wind on a person, or in this case a child, a little girl, is dispelled by the production in that narrative out of the very head, this kind of phantom head up in the sky that turns from the head of a little girl that looks like she's being strangled into a tongue that turns into a tornado that then dispels the scene of violence that had been taking place. So that seems to me extremely interesting. People have said many times in print that Darger was a devout Roman Catholic. That's judging from his work. That's the kind of phrase that's established itself. But I believe that Darger may have been a pretty heterodox kind of Catholic, judging from work of his like this. He may have handled some of his social needs, here I'm just speculating, but maybe he did, by attending Mass, as he's said to have done on a daily basis, and sometimes 3 or 4 times a day on Sunday. I don't know, but it seems to me it's like a fairly low intensity way of being around a group of what were likely fairly familiar people. Without, I mean, I think you didn't even say peace be with you and shake hands at that point, if my memories of childhood serve. So you didn't really have to engage with them very closely. And there is, of course, this enveloping aura of everybody's there for a high spiritual purpose. So what I want to speculate about is that Darger's real religion may have had a lot to do with the way his work manifests this intense love for and fascination with the changeable weather, the tendency of the weather to change. And I want to think about not just super severe extreme weather like cyclones and tornadoes and flash flooding and massive forest fires, but also the kind of weather that he recorded in his 10 years of weather diaries, the day by day, hour by hour, moment to moment awareness of the weather. You know, the main conflict in the weather diaries is his scorn for the weatherman, who's wrong 60-70% of the time. Now they won't even predict, they just tell you what the computer says and blame it on the computer. So that's the first half of my presentation, and the second half is on weather and sexuality. So here I want to switch gears in my account of Darger's relationship and the relationship of his work, the story we can tell about it, and the weather. And especially in modulating from the kind of story I have been telling, which is mostly about extreme, severe, world history shaping weather, to this kind of more everyday, ordinary, non-severe weather. And I want to think about how that may give us some means of understanding, I don't know if Darger's sexuality in particular, but I just want to imagine and invite you to imagine that kind of weather has a kind of eros and a kind of sexual import and effect, set of effects as well. And in starting to do that, I want to look at this other Darger image with you. It's one of my personal favorites. I think it's very beautiful and very strange. It's captioned that it's Robert Vivian, who's the brother of the Emperor Vivian, who's the father of the Vivian girls. It's Robert Vivian standing at the seashore. Really, any of you who know romantic German art, Caspar David Friedrich, I can't help but think that Darger had seen one. But I also never underestimate Darger's powers of invention. So In some sense, he may have been there first, and Caspar David Friedrich was only limping along behind a century earlier. So here is this figure with his back turned toward us, contemplating this the colors are certainly saturated. This scene that I think it's possible to understand as emotionally as well as coloristically saturated. So here's this viewer who appears to be looking out at this landscape. It's an I think extremely beautiful and also damn strange landscape. This stretch of pale green water that you see, this large fleecy cloud with a deep purple underside there on the right. I'm actually dyslexic, right-left, so if I say right and mean left, you know what I mean. You know where the purple cloud is. And then there's this deep indigo blue-colored hump that, along with the equally intensely colored cloud, dominates the big middle range as far as the upper and lower parts of the picture, the middle of the picture. What is that deep, deep blue hump? I feel I should offer a prize to the audience who can tell me what the deep, deep blue hump is. After contemplating this picture, I mean, not all the time, of course, but intermittently over a period of years, I've sort of accepted, I'm not satisfied with it, but I've kind of accepted that it's a hill. I mean, it seems to have clumps of trees growing on it on the far side. But what kind of hill? And in what kind of light does a hill appear this ink-colored? There are these wisps of bits of cloud, just one or two, peeking over what I'm calling a hill, what I easier in my mind calling this big dark blue hump. But this hill is so strangely composed and colored that I think a viewer may justifiably wonder if its meanings don't considerably exceed any literal meaning that I give it, like saying it's a hill. I'm really not satisfied with that. And I wonder if we shouldn't speculate that it's maybe represents something we could talk about, like Darger's imagination, or if, to take a more psychoanalytic bent, to his unconscious, or just something very strange and big and maybe not knowable, or at least not readily knowable, like the white whale in Moby Dick. What if we take it as a figure for Darger's desire, whatever that may have been for? According to some accounts, Darger had no intimate life, or the intimate life that he had was entirely imaginary. Lived with the Vivian girls and the other child combatants in the Glandico-Angelinian war storm. People also ordinarily think of Darger as having lived and worked in a condition of pretty much total poverty. But to anyone who would just want to fix on the fact that Darger was very poor, I would want to counter that by reminding them that the poet Wallace Stevens said, the greatest poverty is not to live in a physical world. The greatest poverty is not to live in a physical world. Now, judged by this standard, Darger's work suggests that he carried on certainly a rich enough existence, for his love of and frequent awe at the weather in all its phases, peaceful and rageful, suggests that he did indeed live and work in a densely materialized physical world. When we speak of intimacy, emotion, love, physical life, our ordinary way of associating these things together is through the idea of sexuality, or it's one of the main ones. But I want to invite you to think with me here about Darger's weather fascination, or weather love, or weather enjoyment, or weather awe as a kind of eros. What would that be like? In an article about Darger that I published about 5 years ago that I didn't include in Darger's resources in my book, I began by quoting Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman was the subject of my first book. And what I quoted Whitman about was when he says, it's time for the facts of human sexuality to become widely understood and accepted, but he says, I'm not going to argue sexuality by itself, for, he says, it will not stand by itself. And what I take him to mean by that is that sexuality is so imbricated with human lives, human characters, human personalities, human modes of social organization, and just so many other things that arguing sexuality in and for itself makes very little sense. In my 2007 article, I said that I had learned something about the connectedness and pervasiveness of sex from my next younger brother, Tony. As we stood side by side surveying a magazine rack in the grocery store once while our mother was grocery shopping. And I remember we were standing there. I was about 10, so he was about 8. We're standing there, and there are all these weekly news magazines, Time, Newsweek, and the rest, all side by side. And that week, and probably many times over during that period, each one had a huge headline that said "Sex on Campus," like it had just appeared there, never having manifested itself on a U.S. college campus before. In 1960, sex went to college. So in the article I say, I remember wondering aloud, we're standing there looking at these magazine covers, and I said, sex, I wonder what that is. And then there was, I remember, like, beat, 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 moment of silence, and then my shrewd little brother responded, I think it must be something kind of like the weather, kind of everywhere. So I haven't improved on that at this point. That was years before I read Freud. So when I discussed the topic of Darger's possible sexuality in Darger's resources, I speculate that rather than assuming that it was all object-oriented and governed by a dynamics of increasingly intense arousal and then orgasm, we should consider instead that maybe it was informed by a less object-oriented, less arousal and orgasm-driven dynamic than we ordinarily think of adult sexuality as being. Judging from his work, I wonder if Darger didn't retain, perhaps to a degree unusual, but by no means unique among adults in our society, a relation to relatively objectless phenomena such as states of and changes in the weather, changes in light, in color, that are no less genuinely erotically real and compelling, for all that they are not sexual in any narrow sense of the term. And this has come to be a way in which theorists and psychologists have come to understand some of the sexuality of prepubescent children. That's not so cyclical and not so concerned or driven by intensifying levels of arousal, but has to do with sort of sheer physical enjoyment of stimulating and beautiful and changing states, say of weather, of light, of color, of feeling. So I've got a context here for Darger and sexuality, as I did for Darger and war, or in Macadie. And my contrast and compare figure here is not John Greenleaf Whittier. It's George Kuchar, who's pictured on the left in this cover of the DVD from Jennifer Krutz's recent film about the films of the Kuchar brothers. That's George here on the left, and that's his twin brother Mike over there on the right. They're gay twin brothers. Mike is still living. George died last year. They were pioneering DIY, do-it-yourself, underground filmmakers of the 1960s when they were like 12, 14, 16 years old. They get their friends to go up on the roof of their tenement in the Bronx with their little handheld movie camera, and they made dozens and dozens of trashy, melodramatic B-movies with titles like Sins of the Fleshopoids and Hold Me While I'm Naked, and just amazing and fascinating stuff. And like Henry Darger, George Kuchar was a lifelong student and one might say admirer of the weather. Also a lifelong city dweller like Darger in Chicago, where I'm so happy to be talking about Darger. Kuchar grew up in the Bronx, experiencing the weather that he experienced, mostly from the roof of his family's apartment building. He said there didn't seem to be so much weather on the ground in New York City. What you experienced was more up in the sky. And it left George Kuchar with a lifelong fascination with severe weather and a real love of and fascination with clouds. Kuchar trained, and his twin brother trained as a commercial artist. And I don't know if any of you, I lived in New York in the 70s, but for anybody who was there 10 years earlier, you would have seen Frank Fields pioneering live weather forecasts every night on WNBC network news in New York. And George Kuchar was his weather sketcher. So it worked for several years as Frank Fields' weather sketcher. And they didn't have the computer-driven graphics that they've had for years now. So there would be like, kind of taped up, like here's this front coming in. And George Kuchar drew those. And he said it was some of the happiest years of his artistic life when he was Frank Fields' weather sketch artist. Again, like Darger, George Kuchar produced a mass of weather diaries. I don't know if any of you keeps a weather diary, but George Kuchar and Henry Darger both did. In Kuchar's case, these weather diaries are videos that he started making in 1977 and continued making regularly for over 30 years thereafter. So there he's even going Darger 3 times as good. Darger has 10 years of moment-by-moment weather diaries, and George Kuchar has over 30 years of video weather diaries that he made incessantly. The first of these is entitled A Wild Night in El Reno. Taken by surprise, and as I say, being from Oklahoma, I remember what it's like to be taken by surprise by severe weather. It was a lovely spring day 10 minutes ago, and now there's a twister in the backyard. Taken by surprise by severe weather on a visit to Oklahoma, Kuchar pulled over, checked into a motel in El Reno, Oklahoma. The video he made of the storm that shook the area that night was the first of these many weather diary projects that brought him back to El Reno May after May every year for many years to continue his weather diary projects there in El Reno. Even after the motel where he used to stay every year was converted to an elder care facility, they still rented him a room for the month of May. Have you ever heard of this level of artistic dedication? He has, footage of himself lying there in his bed in his little room in what's become the elder care facility, just hanging out waiting for that next big tornado. Kuchar is very queer. Kuchar is not exactly a storm chaser. In fact, he says in one of his other weather videos that he never became a storm chaser because New Yorker to the death, he never learned to drive a car. He says, rather than a storm chaser, he thinks of himself as a storm squatter. He sits there and waits for them to come to him. He's one of the greatest drollest queer comedians of modern film narrative. And if any of you are interested, I hope maybe at least a few of you will be, especially since his death last year, various of his weather diaries are all over the internet. So if you would like to see, for example, the first of them, Wild Night in El Reno, it's only 5 minutes long. It's not a big part of anybody's day. And it's available on a bunch of websites, including UbuWeb, which has so much amazing artistic, both print and video and film material. It's on UbuWeb, it's on Penn Sound, which is the University of Pennsylvania's now huge website of poets and artists and their materials. So they have a bunch of Kuchar videos on there, including several of the weather videos. That's Penn Sound. And by God, you can watch Wild Night in El Reno on YouTube. Simple as that. There it is. So in Wild Night in El Reno and many of the weather diary videos that followed it, Kuchar not only shows, presents footage of thrilling and terrifying windstorms and tornadoes and horrendous rains, but also, and indeed more often, those long stretches in between, these very lackluster times there at the motel, or when he's walking back and forth to the convenience store down the road, which he subsists on for the entire month, eating, he claims, exclusively, you all know these brands, some of you do from childhood, Dinty Moore, canned stew, beef stew, canned chili, canned tamales. So this diet on an annual basis produces these alternating waves, according to Kuchar in his videos, of constipation and diarrhea, which again is excruciatingly charted in the video Weather Diaries. So the rest of the time he shows himself engaging in mock conversations with the Oklahoma City weathermen on TV about when the next big storm is going to be and where it's going to hit, likely to hit. He also shows himself spending lots of time scoping out the hunky, shirtless adolescent boys he spies playing ball in the field behind the motel or hanging out, engaging in horseplay at the neighborhood public pool. And like the consequences and results of the heavy canned food diet that Kuchar's videos spare us no detail of, the consequences and results of the kind of sexual buildup that ensues on his similarly steady, you should pardon the expression, kind of junk food diet of voyeuristic, frustrated, horny, voyeuristic watching are also scrupulously recorded in the video Weather Diaries. In Weather Diary 3 from 1988, Kuchar's intense, I skipped a sentence, to say that they're scrupulously recorded in shots of Kuchar masturbating energetically in the motel shower. In Weather Diary 3 from 1988, Kuchar's intense solitude, as he mostly shows it in these weather videos, is briefly interrupted by the arrival for a visit of a 21-year-old student friend of his named Michael Kuderman, who shares Kuchar's fascination with photographing severe weather. Kuchar shows himself eating more bad food in a local eatery, chicken fried steak and frozen chicken fried steak thawed, and instant mashed potatoes and gravy, as well as hanging out with Michael Kuderman in his motel room, again arguing with the TV weatherman, and sitting on the couch together looking at this mini series of still photographs that Kuderman brings to share with Kuchar of severe weather events up and down the Midwest that he's been traveling and photographing. In a video made the following year after the Weather Diary 3 in '88, this one entitled 50 Millibars to Ecstasy, Kuchar depicts a campus visit he'd made to the University of Wisconsin at Madison to show a bunch of his videos, where he re-encounters Mike Kuderman, who is at that time studying for an advanced degree in meteorology at the University of Wisconsin. In voiceover, Kuchar expresses his regret that there had been no storm action the previous May in Oklahoma when the young man had visited him at his motel. And the video and the soundtrack at that point are edited in a way that makes it unmistakable that the viewer is not supposed to miss the double entendre at the same moment that Kuchar is really sorry there had been no storm action between himself and Michael Kuderman either. You can just kind of wanly regret it now. Now, I'm a little bit touched by the continuation from one narrative to the other of this almost unspoken romance of Kuchar and for Mike Kuderman, but I'm also somewhat skeptical about it, as I am myself a lifelong watcher of Kuchar brothers' videos. And I know that George Kuchar has been making fun of himself in his films as a big sexual and romantic loser, including masturbation scenes in the showers since the mid-1960s. He does that in Hold Me While I'm Naked, the film I mentioned earlier. Although the difference between those two films is that the more recent one is frontal shot and the last one is basically through the shower curtain. Kuchar's weather videos do sometimes exude a sense of melancholy loneliness, but I would say that's really not their dominant tone. Much of the time, Kuchar depicts himself as someone who knows what he likes. He likes making videos about his life, including his intimate life, his alimentary digestive life, his would-be sex life, and so on. And he shows himself enthusiastically going about every aspect of his life that feeds his creative projects. I think only the most naive or inattentive viewer actually could come away from Kuchar's weather videos believing that they're primarily about his attempts to sublimate his frustrated sexuality into an obsession with tornadoes. In a 1997 essay that Kuchar published about his annual visits to Tornado Alley in Oklahoma, Kuchar admits, and I quote, "When I go to Oklahoma, I'm really there for the weather, not for the flesh." But Darger's depiction of human tongue as tornado and that strange painting and writing of his that we considered a few minutes ago weirdly and forcefully reminds us that for some, weather can take on a kind of flesh of its own, a kind of fleshiness of its own. I write in Darger's Resources about French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty and his idea of the flesh of the world in relation, and I write about that in relation to Darger's work. In the present context, I want to extend that idea, the flesh of the world, to include the flesh of the weather. After all, so much of our experience of the weather takes place on our skin, whether it's hot or cold or windy or raining. And I wonder if we might not be able to think about this weather itself and different kinds of weather having their own kinds of skin or surfaces. So, in closing, let me say, when Kuchar died last year, Noel Lawrence, one of his many friends and longtime associates who wrote about Kuchar online at that point, commented that George Kuchar made much more work than could be distributed. No, he had tried to get a distribution deal going with his own indie video company to distribute Kuchar's work, and he says that Kuchar told him, "No, you're gonna ruin my whole deal. I am a legendary filmmaker. If people see my films and see how terrible they are, the jig will be up. You will have blown my mystique. Keep the legend alive." I think he's a fabulous filmmaker, but if he wants to joke about being a legendary, terrible filmmaker, I can let him. Anyway, this guy, Noel Lawrence, commented that Kuchar just made work all the time. And Lawrence says that really his basic emphasis for making it seems to be to show it to friends. And he says whenever he went to visit George Kuchar, they would talk for 15 or 20 minutes, and then Kuchar would start like, I've got all this work I want to show you. And they'd be up the rest of the night looking at all his recent trips. He visited Emory, where I teach, in Atlanta a couple years ago, and he was only back in San Francisco at home for a couple of days, and we got the inevitable and fabulous DVD of like his Atlanta visit diary. So how many filmmakers are so creative and so generous that his trip to us was as meaningful as everything else he was doing creatively that year, and there's a video about it. So we think of Kuchar, as Lawrence says, making so much work, being so creative, being so productive because he loved to show it to his friends. What energy, what impetus did Darger work out of? Since as far as we know, he didn't show his work to anybody. What I see in Darger's relationship, both as an artist and as a person, possibly, with the weather, is a kind of 0 degree of the cultivation, enjoyment, and circulation of a kind of low-grade but sustainable, set of pleasures. Pleasures may have been for him, pleasures can be there for us. Pleasures in things like the weather and the weather changing. Looking at some of Darger's depictions of different weathers and reading some of his many accounts of weather, including his weather diaries, helps me see how artists such as Henry Darger and George Kuchar succeed in maintaining an intimate relationship with the sources of their own creativity throughout their entire lives. And I must tell you, the longer I live, the more I see how tricky and difficult just those creative energies can be to sustain year in and year out. So when I recognize it, see it in the work of artists like these, I want to bow to it. I respect that so deeply. In the respective bodies of work of these two artists, the kitschy cliche of the seasons of the years serving as models for the seasons of our lives cease to seem so kitschy and so cliched, and make me wonder how much more we can learn from studying their weather awe and their weather art. You have been an extremely attentive audience, and I thank you for your attention. Supercell, George Kuchar talks about supercell clouds a lot. They tend to turn, this is supercell, they tend to turn into massive tornadoes. Maybe Sweetie Pie began life as supercell before there was the term.
Michael, do you want to take questions from you?
I'd love to. You've listened so attentively. I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments.
I'm going to speculate a little bit on how self-aware you think Darger was about what he was doing. I mean, it's fascinating with the tongue and all this other stuff. And it's obviously we can bring all these ideas to it, but and I think it's all real what you're coming up with. But what do you think? And I know there's no way you can. Do you think about this? How self-aware Darger was?
Sure. Anybody works on anything for years and you think about it. But I'm agnostic about it. I don't go there. I wasn't with him, and if I'd been in the room with him, I'm not sure I would have had any better sense of like what you're calling his self-awareness, how much he had in mind, or whether this was his intention, his thought. I don't know. So I think that's really the fabulous thing about art is it's in a way completely transferable and it just circulates and everybody can try it on for size and make up what we will. But every audience I speak to, I get this question in a lot of different forms. It's like, well, what about him? What was he doing? What did he imagine he was about? What did he imagine he was doing? I don't care. Do you care?
Yeah.
Okay.
I know. I'm fascinated.
People are different.
I'm preoccupied by it. I mean, like for example, if you look at a Van Gogh painting, it seems really clear to me that he cared about light.
About life.
Yeah, and that he was motivated. Light, yes. And then he was
About light.
Light, yes. L-I-G-H-T.
Thank you.
Yeah. And that when he painted, he was focusing on light, and that light was important to him, probably in the way weather was important to Darger. But it seems conscious.
I talked about weather, but a lot of things are important to Darger, including light. And I mean, especially color. I'm a color junkie, just full disclosure. All my life, I think before I could speak. I just like colors are just like a drug to me. So, and I'm willing to speculate with you and many other people who are interested in this that he does seem to have been extremely susceptible to color variation and brilliant colors and sparkling colors. But I don't know. It always seems like the next step is, so he was this type of person psychologically, and it's about some limitation, and it's like, yeah, Van Gogh's interested in light, and Henry Darger's interested in light, and Van Gogh is certainly like acutely attuned to color, and Darger is attuned to color. So I don't see that he's a different kind of artist, or that it's so mysterious what his relation to the way he worked and the means that he used and the effects that he produced were. Yes?
Was he really entirely solitary? Were there people in his life?
Well, there are inevitably people in everybody's life.
Right, but I mean, do you know specifically? People who were important in his family doing this, he's living alone.
He grew up in a family. His mother died, and many of you know this, died in childbirth just before he turned 4 with an infant girl who was given up for adoption. And he lived with his father until he was 10 or 12, and then his father became too lame to take care of him, according to the records, and he went into first an orphanage, and then a few years later, he basically spent his teenage years to the age of 17 in the Illinois Home for Feeble-Minded Children in Lincoln. So he lived among hundreds and hundreds of kids and, attendants and all, till he escaped when he was 17. And then he went back and he did work for 50, 60 years as a janitor. So you can't get away from people working as a janitor. So I feel like there's this kind of myth that Darger lived in total solitude. It's like he worked as a janitor for 50 or 60 years.
Well, did he let anyone into his room? Because, like, you know, in the movie, the landlord that knew him, kind of knew him, but I was trying to remember.
He had a friend,
He had a friend.
He did have a
Yeah.
friend
Yeah.
when he was young.
yeah, he has pictures,
Yeah,
pictures that he took with, and,
at an amusement park.
right.
Yeah,
At Riverview.
at Riverview.
And also, some of the students that lived in that building
Yes,
at the
befriended him.
time, right, they fed him and did all kinds of
Bathed
stuff.
him, according
Yeah,
to their own
right.
testimony. Yeah, yes.
Because I was wondering if there were any, like, personal accounts of other people after he died, what he was like, or.
Well, Nathan and Kyoko Lerner certainly were, you know, as his landlords, but also kind of contributed to supporting him and not raising his rent. I mean, Kyoko Lerner tells about, and I think this is in Jessica Hughes' documentary, tells about, like, Darger was this kind of tenant. He would, like, come by the door and go, light bulbs out. And so Kyoko Lerner said she went in later that day and changed the light bulb over the table where he was working. And she said that she started to get down from the table and she, if I'm recalling this correctly from the documentary, she saw that he was drawing something and she said, I believe, I want to try to quote her accurately, Henry, you're a good artist. Just in passing, just glancing at a sketch, and went on walking away. And she said that Darger replied, yes. As far as we know, that this is this artist's longest conversation about his art. Henry, you're a good artist. Yes. Yes.
What led you to first associate with the Darger world? What led you-
Seeing the big exhibit in New York in 1998 at the Museum of American Folk Art, I am really interested, like the kind of art that I find irresistible is serial art. So any kind, especially serial narrative art. So the subject of my first book, Walt Whitman, he only wrote one book, Leaves of Grass, his whole life. But when he started, it only had 12 poems in it. When he died, it had hundreds of poems in it. So the book kept growing, but he only had one book, unlike almost any other author that we know of. So my first book was about the serial production of Leaves of Grass and how it grew from a little tiny skinny, like many of us did, a little tiny skinny volume to like quite a bulky volume. And so it was really the idea of his having produced this massive serial narrative. And then, I mean, I don't think I would have cared about the 60,000 pages of writing if I hadn't been seduced and captured and captivated by what I think of as the great beauty and delicacy of his graphic and watercolor art. So the other thing is, I didn't realize this until I was working on Darger, that my second book, my previous book, had been about figures like Joseph Cornell and the artists Joseph Cornell and Andy Warhol. And what I realized after I started working on Darger is that I was like, had found another artist, visual artist, who had left a massive archive of writing that nobody knew what to do with, which is the case with Joseph Cornell, Andy Warhol, and Henry Darger. So that's another way that I think, like, Darger has so much in common with a lot of other very creative artists. He's not some unique, pitiful figure by any means. He's an amazingly productive and creative artist, very much part of the artistic waves and currents of his time. He just didn't go to the same parties, or any parties, unless it was the holiday party at the hospital where he was a janitor. I don't know. Yes?
It's all very interesting how most people like to qualify Darger as a tragic figure, and so bringing this weather into a conversation is interesting because he relates to weather in a very interesting way, in a heroic way. And so I was wondering if in your readings of his weather diaries, if you found, or how you would describe his relationship with weather. Was it a good one or a bad one? Did he...
This relationship with what?
With weather, if it was
It was a
personified?
complicated one. I think it was a rich one. He loved it. But he also loved all these things that I write about in Darger's resources. His resources are the burgeoning early pop culture of the 1890s to the 1940s and 50s. That is the first 50 years or so of his life. the newspaper comic strips, which were born essentially the same year that he was born, the early 1890s. So the weather isn't the only thing that he loved and had a complicated relationship with.
Do you think, was it more admiration or fear, do you think he had?
A lot of both.
Every day it changed, probably.
Yeah, it just, you know, just kind of like if you've been, I've been with my partner for 28 years, and just a lot of it is just the comfort of like the everydayness of being together. We're both academics, so we're actually at home a lot of the time and working in our respective studies. And just, that's a real baseline in my experience in my life, and so is my work. And I feel like that's part of my bond with Darger, is that I felt that I could see from his work that he really loved his work. His work kept him going. His love was, his work was his world, and it's a really rich world. I don't see that it's impoverished or pathetic world.
It was always Sweetie Pie was the name of
The
song.
tornado that he wrote about late in his life, when he started to write his autobiography and wrote the 5,000-page career of Sweetie Pie, the mother of all mean upper Midwestern tornadoes. Yes?
I know some of Darger's work, but how omnipresent was weather, or is weather in his art and his 60,000 pages?
To an unusually high degree.
Okay, so in what way, though? Does he just kind of mention that there's a storm, or?
Oh, no. If you write 5,000 pages
Yeah.
about one tornado, it just does this, and then it does that, and these are its effects, and it causes this forest fire and this flood, and then he just goes on and on and on. It's a fascination, it's an obsession, it's kind of a life pursuit.
Does he sometimes start out by talking about weather and then it ends up a discussion or something else?
More usually he starts out talking about something else and it turns into a discussion of weather. The sequence tends to go that way. Yes?
Yeah, so do you see any relation between this obsessive working on, say, on one piece of weather to his obsession of saving rubber bands and strings and all
Yeah, I
that
think that's sort
crap?
of like the kind of more
Sounds
mechanical
almost the
aspect.
same thing you
Yeah,
gathered.
yeah. So he appears to have been obsessive, whether it was about collecting rubber bands or writing 5,000 pages about a single tornado. On the other hand, lots of people are obsessive and they don't produce really interesting, imaginative art and writing. So it's
So
the
it
art and
seems
writing.
almost like two sides of the same thing.
Could be.
Mentally.
Yeah, I mean, academics by and large have so much trouble writing. And it just amuses me that I work on somebody who was a janitor who wrote 1,000 times as much as most star academics. It was a commitment that must have had a strong obsessive edge, but then I like to say that the obsession had a strong creative edge.
Because he wrote first, right?
Yes, he wrote for years before he started just discovering his own ability to produce creative graphic work, starting with just little collages and kind of pasting things together and doing little 1 or 2 color experiments. Brooke Anderson at the Folk Art Museum introduced me to all the little pots that they preserved from dime store watercolor sets, children's watercolor sets that he worked with, and all these little pots in which he carried out these many experiences combining colors and doing sort of hue experimentation. We think it was very advanced artistic practice, like Joseph Alberts or somebody who's going to teach that level of hue experimentation. He did it with children's watercolor sets from the dime store. You got it.
I'm sorry if you covered it already, but I was curious to know how much of Henry's work that you actually read, and
Not all 60,000 pages.
and approximately how long it took you to get through each of what you read.
Yeah, I felt like since the writing especially seemed so kind of repetitive and like we were off again in the right direction, that any 5,000 or 6,000 pages would do. So I used to just go to the Folk Art Museum and print out from the what do they call the technologies already? Microfiche, yes, thank you.
We have microfilm here.
Microfilm, okay.
So you're actually allowed to print that out?
Yeah, bunches of it. Yeah, also I just sit there and read it. I
You
actually
have it
probably-
here.
Last I knew.
Do you have microfilm of a lot of the writings?
Wow.
All the whole thing,
Yeah.
fabulous. That's really precious resource. I wish more could be more widely available. I didn't print out those thousands of pages a lot. A lot of days I just sat there and read, would print out stuff that seemed to be something that I wanted to think more about.
So you didn't complete any different project that you worked on? When you start to finish?
There are long projects within the 15,000, for example, the 15,000 pages of the realms of the unreal.
Mhm.
So yeah, I sort of read this various of this kind of sub-volumes. Anything else?
Thank you so much, Michael.
You're so welcome.